Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. Begin. All right, so check-ins. I feel deeply peaceful and with a delicious focus. Welcome to the Stoa. I am Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And today we're very lucky to have Joe Brewer. And how it's going to work, if you're familiar with the Stoa, we're going to do a question and answer period. Joe's going to share his thoughts, and then we'll have a chance to source the collective intelligence. So Raven, yeah, we're going to hand it over to Raven, so Raven can introduce Joe and tell us how it's going to work today.
Great, thanks, Peter. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to have Joe today. So Joe is a change strategist working on behalf of humanity, and I'm going to bounce it over to him to give a more full introduction since he's been working on so many projects recently. So Joe, welcome to the Stoa.
Thank you, Raven. Thank you, Peter. It's lovely to be here. I know some of you already know me, but I'm sort of one of those anti-box people, so I don't like to fit into boxes. I bet a lot of you can relate to that. And I think my big focus areas over the last couple of decades have been in complexity science and cultural evolution, all directed toward trying to keep humans from going extinct, which we are foolishly at jeopardy of doing at the moment. And so a lot of what I will talk with you about today is my experiences and learnings about the planetary scale ecological crisis that we're in and the global systems of human cultures that are driving it, and what we might need to do in order to have beautiful pastures on the other side, or maybe better yet, beautiful food forests and fully intact ecosystems. So it's lovely to be here.
Great, so go ahead and lift us off into Joe world. Love to hear from you.
Sure. Well, one thing I want to say in starting is that a lot of my perspective across my life and the work that I do comes from an experience of feeling like an alien when I was a little kid, which was like 3 years old on the playground in preschool, wondering why all the kids were so mean to each other. And then spending a lot of time in nature on the farm where I grew up in Missouri, feeling like I didn't belong, and actually kind of hating humans in a lot of ways, like having a chip on my shoulder in that teenage way and stuff. And a lot of it being because I'm a really emotionally sensitive person, but I'm also a pretty good analytic thinker. And so, so I start there because I feel like we're in a crisis right now that I would call a spiritual crisis. And it's a spiritual crisis having to do with the very nature of our existence as human beings, and a spiritual crisis because it's about the depths and foundations of meaning and what we consider to be sacred, and mostly about our lack of sense making around the sacred. A lot of people find having jobs and mythical security as sacred when they send their kids away and then never see their kids. And I think there's a lot of confusion like this around. They would much rather have times with their kids, but what's sacred isn't what they do. And that disconnect is very real. For me, a lot of what I see happening in the world today is based on a developmental pattern within the Earth's biosphere that goes back at least 3 million years. And I want to tell the story in this way because I think that too often we contextualize what's happening now around superficial and symptomatic things, like there's a global pandemic and that's the problem. Which is like, no, that's a symptom of a globally interconnected human economy. That's not a cause of the problem. And I think that mismatch between true driving patterns and what's going on is a real discernment opportunity for us. If we can discern causation well, we can actually do something about the predicaments we're in. And I go back 3 million years in time to tell this story because something novel happened about 3 million years ago in the history of the Earth's biosphere, which is for the first time, at least that we have any empirical record of, some piece of the Earth's biosphere gained a symbolic capacity for conceptual thought. And that is that our Homo habilis ancestors, the stone tool users, could look at a rock and metaphorically project other uses onto it and then carve and shape it into those uses. And so that's how they created their hand-wielded cutting tools from stone. So 3 million years ago, our ancestors evolved the capacity for conceptual metaphor, which is a foundational piece of human language and the human mind. This began what became eventually a runaway process of cultural evolution, which is what we're dealing with in the world today. Just basically, there emerged from this initial conceptual capacity of our ancestors the ability to have an evolutionary process for human culture that would be either deeply integrated with its background ecology, or it could become separate from it and could function in parallel. And this is what a lot of people in cultural evolution research, they call dual inheritance theory, that there's an inheritance of genetics and the biome, the biological inheritance, and there's also cultural evolutionary inheritance. Like, we don't develop languages ourselves, they're taught to us by our culture. And a lot of what we get as humans is being adapted to environments that are as much human constructed environments as they are natural ecological environments. And this actually goes back to those stone tools 3 million years ago. I start here because the problem we have in the world today is that cultural evolution in humans, there are other kinds of cultural evolution, by the way, like birds with their bird songs and whales with their whale songs and so on. So cultural evolution is not limited to humans, but humans have something that so far seems to be the one standout thing that makes us different, is cultural evolution in the human line is cumulative, whereas it's not cumulative in any other species that we have evidence for. Cumulative processes, by the way, compounding interest and so on, they create exponential change patterns. So cumulative cultural evolution in the human line makes cultural evolution potentially exponential. And our cultural evolution has become exponential, which is why we're able to do things like destabilize the entire planet's climate system, because our culture is now more powerful than the Earth's climate regulatory capacities. So this thing of an exponential change in culture is one of the fundamental drivers of change on the planet right now. And that's why we call this time, at least geologists do, they call it the Anthropocene. We've entered this unique time in history. What I want to share is some of what I see happening with the Anthropocene as it relates to the work of Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock with what they called the Gaia Hypothesis. And some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, but for those of you who aren't, James Lovelock, it was one of those strange polymaths who could look at a problem unlike anyone else around him. And when he was working for Caltech on some of their satellite research projects, he was asked a very specific question. The question they asked him was, what is the chemical signature of life on a planet? If we were going to build a satellite sensor, how would we know if there's life on that planet? And he thought about it for a little while and said, well, there would be chemical processes that would be far from equilibrium, because living systems drive chemistry far from equilibrium. So you would see things like high concentrations of oxygen in the atmosphere, because oxygen is highly reactive and would move toward equilibrium very quickly unless there's life that's reproducing it. And then they developed a sensor to look at the oxygen absorption bands, including O3 or ozone. That's how they discovered the ozone layer and the ozone hole, or rather, that's how the ozone hole was discovered. And so he and Lynn Margulis developed a framework for the entire planet to be self-regulatory with these processes. So the Gaia hypothesis is that the Earth's biosphere regulates the chemistry of the Earth to keep life conducive to life, to paraphrase Janine Benyus, as she says this. The entire planet does this. What's different about humans is humans are able to be compassionate, analytic, conscious, and self-aware parts of the planet while it's doing this. And so we are watching ourselves destroy ourselves, which anthropologists and psychologists talk about how this creates a thing called terror management, the need to manage the terror of knowing our own death, which is related to consumer marketing and lots of fun ways we could discuss in the Q&A part if people are interested. But what's really interesting is right now we're in a time where the Gaia hypothesis could become the Gaia, like the Gaia design pathway, where we as humans could collectively decide to design a pathway of regulating and maintaining homeostasis for the Earth. And if we did that, then we would get to stick around. And if we don't do that, then we may do like 99.7% of all other species and go extinct. And so, so what I see right now is our interesting opportunity to recognize the ways that we have taken things far from equilibrium that are destructive, like pulling a whole bunch of dead sunlight out of the ground and pumping it into the biosphere and the Earth's atmosphere in a span of 200 years. Seems like that was a pretty dumb idea. And overgrowing and overshooting the human population by several billion people was a bad idea. And so now we're gonna have to deal with the ecological consequences of planetary overshoot, which are now decades old and were initiated before anyone on this call was born. And we have to deal with a massive grieving process of dealing with the reality of how much suffering we've already caused and how much is now guaranteed and built in for the next 50 to 100 years. Because if we can hold the capacity to do that, then we can do something amazing, which is we can bring robust and dynamic life back to landscapes all across the planet as the human population corrects itself ecologically. And as the capitalist extractive economic models and the dominance territorial conquest models of empires and civilizations all self-terminate, because that's what they all do. If you look at the history of civilizations and empires, every single one of them has collapsed. So this one will too, that's guaranteed. And so our work is not to save this civilization, but to keep humans as part of the planet afterwards. And just saying this, you can see this is a tough pill to swallow. There's a lot of grief, a lot of trauma associated with this, but I just don't want to waste any time being gentle about it because it's the year 2020. Climate action needed to be taken 40 years ago and we didn't. The Green Revolution shouldn't have happened 70 years ago when it did. And other things that we're now dealing with the natural consequences of. And so those of us who are going to try to do really deep systemic work now need to have really good discernment skills for what the hell's going on. And one thing that's going on is we are centuries to millennia into a process of planetary collapse caused by human culture. And we're in the very late stages of it. And it's not in the future, it's in the past and in the present. But the only thing that remains is the human civilization model to collapse as the last part of it. And if we trigger a mass extinction event, then we drive ourselves away too. So with this knowledge and perspective, what I've been doing and a lot of my friends are doing is learning how to regenerate landscapes and build regional scale economies that function as living systems. And that's something that we now have, we fully have the capacity to do that. A lot of people are attempting it, and there are a lot of great examples out there in the world of people doing it right now. And last year I was part of a group called the Regenerative Communities Network, which is a community of bioregional collaboratives where people are learning how to create regional scale or territorial scale economies. For example, the Hudson Valley in upstate New York, or the Food Shed around Boulder, Colorado, or the Osa Peninsula in Costa Rica, which has 2.5% of the world's biodiversity, and so on. There are models of people doing this at very large scales all over the world, and it's really hard work. And it also can't be done unless we compost the global system, which means the global system has to die. So I'll stop here by summarizing or paraphrasing the words of Joanna Macy and just say, our work is to be hospice workers and midwives. And we have to do both at the same time. And we have to do it with the cumulative powers of cultural evolution by quoting another friend of mine and a mentor, David Sloan Wilson, who says we need to become wise managers of our own evolutionary process. So we have to understand how evolution, how it works, what its mechanisms and dynamics are. And then we need to employ it with the most wisdom we can, using that word on purpose because most of that wisdom is in our indigenous cultures and not in our civilizations. Although not all of it's there. So let's not romanticize human systems that are real human systems. But there's a lot to learn from the indigenous because most of them actually have been sustainable cultures in the past. So I'll stop there because I think we're gonna have a really rich conversation from this provocation. And I'm just excited to be here with all of you. So thank you for letting me rant for a few minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. So yeah, if things are coming up for people, you can go ahead and put your question in the chat and I will call your name and you can ask your question directly to Joe. And I'll just warm Joe up a little bit here. So initially, I would just like to ask you about the role of religion in all of this. I think in the secular world, we struggle with the idea of becoming religious. There's even an idea around the Stoa of like the religion of no religion, you know, kind of still grappling with this idea of religion. What do you think about that? And what role does religion have to play in Earth regeneration?
There's a really great book by a guy named Edward Goldsmith. He's a cross-cultural anthropologist, and his book is called The Stable Society. What he observed was that every stable society, translation, every sustainable culture, has pro-future social norms embodied through religious practices that personify nature and treat it as sacred. So the river is not an object, the river is a person. The mountain is not an object, the mountain is a person. The bear is not an object, the bear is a person. And they're kinship relationships that honor the other being as sacred. So if you look just with empirical evidence of human culture, this has been an essential element of sustainability. So this indigenous aspect of spirituality is essential. Now religion plays another important role that is beyond this, and I'll use the example of Bali and their subaks. So subaks are basically nested areas of water and land management for terraced gardens, where the terraced gardens are mostly growing rice. And the thing to know about the subaks in Bali is that they're structured as nested fractals around a series of, or a network of different water temples. And these water temples have a religion of treating each piece of land and each of the waterways as having its own spirit or its own god or goddess. And when people pay homage to the gods or the goddesses, they are actually reporting and accounting the information they need for collective land management. And so they have managed their water system for more than 1,000 years at high levels of productivity without destroying the water or the land availability because of the cooperation enabled by their religion. So the big lesson for us from religion is that it is a way of recognizing how to bring cultural evolution to have cooperation occur at higher levels and to be functional at those higher levels. You can get really strong group selection patterns. And that's a really key thing about religions. So they don't necessarily need to be structured as religions to do that, but that's an essential piece of religions. So, so those are two answers, two pieces of that question.
Great, thank you. And then I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Benjamin. As far as renewable materials for sustaining civilizations, what makes sense to cultivate? What makes sense to abandon?
Well, one thing we need to look at is the self-renewing patterns of the Earth that are at the planetary scale. And this will start to give us some answers. One of the most important measures we need to be aware of is called net primary production, which is if you look at the entire planet's surface and add up all of the photosynthesis that's happening, then you'll get this measure of net primary production. Primary production is plant biomass forming from photosynthesis. And there are a lot of ecological reasons why that is a foundational capacity for any ecosystem. The productivity of the plants is one of the limiting factors of what the ecosystems can do. So if we look at things like solar panels or wind turbines, which have a lot of non-renewable things in them, and currently they require a lot of fossil fuels to make them, and they're nothing close to a solution in a systemic way for these reasons. There's another thing is we need to understand the resilience of food webs and ecosystems to see that if we destroy intact forests and replace them with wind turbines and collapse biodiversity, eventually we're going to trigger an extinction event and go away, even though we quote unquote solved our energy needs. The reason being that we converted too much of the land surface into machines primarily for human uses. And that anthropocentrism was actually the problem. So when we look at materials that have different limits, we need to look at them in these two ways. One is, what are their total capacities? Like how much net primary production is there? And then the other is, what are their distributive qualities that allow them to be resilient? So if net primary production, or solar energy being turned into life, is put into a brittle ecosystem, very small biodiversity and primarily humans, or domesticated animals for humans or whatever else, then you have a fragile system that can collapse. And so the question is answered both in the amount of the materials and their network relationships. And it's together that we see whether or not they're truly renewable. So this is important for metal ore, where you get the metal ore by cutting down mountains and blowing them up with fossil fuels and destroying biodiversity and other things like this. So it's a really interesting thing to flip this conversation from how much of the material is there to instead, what are the resilience patterns of network connectivity, and what are the disruption tolerances to those networks? So it's not how much ore is available, it's how much ore can we take without destroying these ecosystems? And most people don't contextualize the question in this way, so it becomes a raw number. And that's a really dangerous thing to do.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe Gray, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, thank you. I hear from you an emphasis on the grief that there is to feel over what has already sort of occurred before we can really move forward with what has to be done next. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how we can really appreciate the value of that work and prioritize it.
Yeah, I have a specific perspective on this that I hope is helpful. And it comes in two parts. One part is how ecological succession works, which is that new life emerges by consuming the bodies of the dead. So we have to have a way of celebrating death and have a healthy relationship to death. Now, I'll just let that stand as sort of like a philosophical perspective, because there's a lot to say about it. The other part that's much more practical and tangible is that our greatest capacity as human beings is our capacity to have empathy, and then from the empathy to have nuance. And if we're going to go into a degraded landscape, like where I'm living right now in Colombia, we're in a tropical dry forest, 98% deforested. So a lot of people would look at this as a dead landscape. But if you're a sensitive person, you'll pay attention to the patterns. And if you're a sensitive person, you'll notice where life still exists. But if you're a sensitive person, you will also be hurt by harm caused to life. And so the grief that you have that gets converted into trauma is the numbing of that sensitivity. And if that sensitivity is numb, then you can't do permaculture. You can't feel into and pay attention to the patterns and then help them grow. So you have to get to a stage of grieving to become sensitive again. And this is deeply, deeply pragmatic. And so, so I see this as one of the really essential things. And there's also a part related to this about letting go of control. Like we're in a community that's trying to do permaculture led by children. And we're trying to build a regional scale regenerative pattern around children, or set of patterns around children. To go out like we did this morning when we were digging water retention, like little ponds and starting to build swales, with our 3-year-old daughter playing with one of the pickaxes and digging in the hole with us. We need to actually listen to the patterns of the children. And again, that's about celebrating the joy of the future instead of being filled with anguish about the future those children are going to inherit. And so the grieving gets in the way of all these processes. It overwhelms our perception systems that we need to do the work well. So I think that's a really important piece of this. There are a lot of other pieces too, but I'll just hold that one for the sake of the conversation. But I think it's super important.
Wonderful. Daryl, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yes. We've seen blockchain do a lot of wild things with economies, and probably not just the most positive things, but I do wonder, do you see a role for blockchain to support the creation of regenerative economies?
Yeah, so I'll tell this story in a sort of roundabout way, but you'll see its importance in a moment. Because this is related to blockchain and holochain and all the related body of technology work that people are doing. And that is that a study just came out, published in Nature, by a group of researchers at the Santa Fe Institute. It was published last week, so it's very new. And what they did is they looked at the CSHAT World History Data Bank, which is an aggregation of archaeological and anthropological work, so they could do statistical analysis on human societies. And they looked at the patterns of development for 291 political systems, most of which collapsed. And they noticed that there were 2 developmental stages for all of these societies. And this relates to your question. The first one is once they established agriculture, because they were looking at kind of city-state development and beyond. Once they established agriculture, the growth in population drove the growth pattern and complexity pattern for the culture. And this was uniform for all 291 societies until they reached a complexity information threshold, where the complexity of their society became so great that if they did not invent tools for managing information, they very quickly collapsed. Whereas the second phase of development for a subset of these societies was all the ones that created things like accounting systems, money, and other things that could use information to manage complexity. And then from there, you saw a diversity of further development, where each polity developed differently, but it was their capacity for processing information that was important. Now, yeah, I think, Daryl, you probably know the connection, but I'll make it really explicit. What things like blockchain are doing for us is they're giving us a multivariable accounting system that allows us to track multiple parameters at the same time. So we can have very complex information about very complex patterns. And this is going to be really important when we're regenerating ecosystems and when we're building human economies that are integrated with them. So one of the big challenges that's happening in the world right now around regeneration is how to do valuation and risk management for investments for regenerative projects. You know, people from the investment world just don't know how to value things like biodiversity. And so what like the Regen Network is trying to build some of these intermediate tools where they can use things like blockchain to track value creation across the diversity of variables so that you can actually measure the value of it, which allows people to manage risk for investment. So this is one way that complexity can be managed that these tools are really important for. And I see a lot of the decentralization that is about to emerge that allows scalability is going to come from this blockchain and related technology space. But I see it as really important for managing complexity and for discerning reality in evolutionary environments. So I hope that answers the question well enough. I think it's very important.
Thank you. Paul? Would you like to ask your question? I can ask for him if he doesn't.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no, you're okay.
Yeah, I couldn't unmute myself. Sorry about that. Yeah, great stuff. Really enjoy this. But you know, and perhaps because I'm older and I've experienced much more in life, we have an issue that needs to be addressed as well. Humans, for centuries, for millennium, have gone to war against each other for resources. Mostly, it's, you know, that tribe has what I want, so we'll go and take it. Chimpanzees do the same thing. They go to war for resources. No matter how in touch with nature they are and what kind of religions they have, that they respect nature and so forth, they still behave rather poorly against each other when they desire another's resources. How do we overcome this? Because it's part of the sociopathology that humans are blessed with or cursed with. We have this inside of us. How do we overcome?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And one way to think about it is to take population density and increase the number until a threshold is reached. And you'll notice that a scarcity pattern will set in. And this is true with chimpanzees, for example. They do this. And a lot of animals do it. Humans do it too. So the way we need to address this is to employ a specific insight that comes from the study of evolutionary transitions. And an evolutionary transition is when two previously separate living organisms, or two or more, that become symbiotic start to develop enough functional integration that they become interdependent and can no longer survive on their own. And the famous example of this is mitochondria used to be a bacteria that was eaten by another bacteria, sort of lived in its ancestral stomach. But eventually they became so codependent with each other that an evolutionary transition occurred. And we went from prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells, or cells without organelles inside them, to cells with organelles inside them. And this transition to functional interdependence is the key. So the way I see this working for humans is we need to create bioregional economies that are organized around functions of landscapes. It's like watersheds and mountain ranges and coastal estuaries and things like this. And that we need to create trade and exchange between bioregions that lead to, yes, symbiogenesis is the name for this. Thank you, Rose, from the great work of Lynn Margulis. That this is, this functional interdependence comes by intentionally designing for interdependence. This is actually something the globalized economy has done really well. What Brian Barber called the McDonald's effect, just that no two countries that have a McDonald's go to war, and that's because they're economically interdependent. And I think that insight is really important for regenerative economies. If you create a great regenerative economy in one place, all you are is a potential invasion point for someone else who hasn't integrated with you in the future. Now, I can say this as though it's simple. Well, I can say it and it may sound like it's doable and not that hard. This is going to be really, really hard to do. But those of us who are trying to build a planetary regeneration pathway need to know how to build this interdependence from one bioregion to another until they form a mesh network across the entire planet. And we have to do this as we deal with overpopulation and scarcity of resources. And I'll share another study that was one of those statistical overview studies that is really damn depressing, but we need to hold it in mind. There was a study using what's called the HRAF database, the Human Relation Area Files, which is hosted at Yale. And it's a collection of anthropological and archaeological research for different cultures to compare them with each other. And what they did is they created a parameter measuring existential risk. So like in each place, were there a lot of invasions from other cultures? Were there a lot of volcanoes and earthquakes? Was there a lot of extreme weather? And they created a bulk measure of existential risk. And then what they did is they looked across history at all human cultures that were in the database and found that if there's high existential risk, it naturally selects culturally for strongman dictatorships and fundamentalist religion. What does climate change do? It creates widespread existential risk everywhere on Earth. And so we are creating exactly the conditions for strongman governments and fundamentalist religion in this time when we need to create interdependent bioregional economies. So we need to hold the paradox of this in mind, that we're actually entering in one of the worst environments as it relates to existential risk to create the conditions for cooperation and interdependence. But it is exactly for that reason that we have to focus on cooperation and interdependence. And so I think one of the keys is to ask the very question you asked, Paul, which is, you know, this is a real pattern. What do we do about it? Yeah. And we have to ask that in every one of our design questions, in every project we're working on, or else we'll sit in a little kumbaya place until someone invades and kills us. And so we just need to be aware of this. It's an extremely important question and discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Evelyn. Does beginning the work of building a foundation for a new kind of society require defection from this one? How can we foster coordination in the ruins of this society?
Yeah, one of our biggest problems is what I call developmental entrenchment, which is that as structures form, they become limiting factors for future structures to form. It's a fundamental piece of how patterns work. And one of our problems now is that our globalized civilization system or set of systems are all deeply entrenched. And so there's the need to go far enough away from them that you can innovate without being pulled into their constraints. And there's also a need to have a buffer of protection against collapse patterns. One of the measures of this that I think is really interesting is one I learned from Jordan Greenhall, when I was on a call with him last year. I'm guessing a lot of you know who he is. But he is part of a group looking at existential risk. And the group that he's a part of developed a specific measure that was really interesting. They observed that there's a sweet spot of living between 3 and 5 hours away from an international airport, where you're close enough to benefit from the innovation of a city, but far enough away to be buffered from its interconnectivity. And I'm an example of this. I'm in Barichara, Colombia. It's 4 hours to the nearest airport, and there have been 0 cases of COVID here. The big problem is that they shut down all transport in and out of the town, and 80% of the economy is tourism. So they immediately killed the town's economy. But no one's dying from COVID. So you can see that we're in this place where in this town of about 5,000 people, there are at least a couple hundred who have university degrees, have worked in Bogota, or have lived in other cities, but they came here because it's this beautiful, peaceful place in the mountains. So we have captured, or we've harnessed, the creative and innovative potential of the city while buffering and protecting ourselves against collapse patterns. And so I think this is an interesting element of how evolution works for us. Another story I want to briefly tell is something from the work of Ernst Mayr. For those of you who don't know him, Ernst Mayr is one of the most important biologists of the 20th century. And he's well known in the field of biology, but not necessarily outside of it. And he wrote an essay that I read a few years ago about the evolution of novelty. How does something truly new emerge through evolution? And he told the story of lungs for amphibians. Because, you know, all of us land dwellers emerged from fish or from ocean dwellers. So we had to go from gills to lungs. It turns out the way that lungs evolved was that there was a parallel redundant system. The fish could breathe with their gills, so their life supports there was strong natural selection against changing gills. Small tweaks to the gills kills the organism. So don't mess with that. But a lot of fish have these swim bladders that sort of function like really lousy lungs. And they could function like really lousy lungs for lots of generations, gradually becoming more and more like lungs. So the relaxing of evolutionary pressure to select against change with parallel evolution is how novelty emerges. So this is the role of these small towns, these permaculture projects. Yes, slack in the system, exactly. This is slack within the evolutionary process itself. And the way we do this is by creating a structural decoupling and buffering to protect the novel systems. So there's not a lot of debt tying them down. There's not a lot of short-term feedbacks that require them to respond to the other system. There's not a lot of leveraging from this old system that will take the new system down with it if something goes wrong with the old system. And there's a lot of room for creativity and failure, which is extremely important. And all of us who do innovation work know how important the ability to fail is. So I think this perspective on parallel evolution with redundancy and structural separation is really key to answering this question. But that's just one piece, a lot to say.
Thank you. Bart, would you like to ask your question?
All right. Thanks, Joe. So I'm hearing a lot of low-tech solutions for the environmental issues, which make total sense and feel really good. I'm wondering if you see any kind of high-tech solutions out there for environmental issues that are viable. You know, you mentioned wind and solar really not being good long-term solutions for energy issues. I work in the building trades. I really kind of work in the low tech area of energy efficiency, you know, better insulation, better materials, better air tightness, etc. In the kind of greater environmental issues that you're looking at more globally, is there any high tech kind of reason for hope?
I think there are high tech elements, and it's important to separate them from the high tech world to see their value. One of them is biomimicry and material science. But then to step back away from material science and say, well, what happens when you have that much sophistication in biomimicry? Like when you're looking at the molecular level of, you know, energy diffusion processes or whatever other things, that it's that capacity for creativity that's really powerful. And when we try to green our supply chains to remove toxins from the manufacturing materials and other things related to, you know, distributed manufacturing, I think there are two aspects of high tech. One is the material science itself, and the other one is the information ecology, the distribution of information processes. So think of like a million hacker maker spaces around the world with some kind of aggregate learning capacity across them could be extremely high tech. Even though a lot of the things they actually do are like, you know, taking a hammer and banging on a piece of metal. So it's a mix, it's a real mix. The other one, which I saw named into the chat with drones, is using remote sensing information processing, and specifically one of the biggest revolutions in human history, which is what computer science really did. Computer science gave us the ability to run simulations of reality and explore reality using simulations. We could do computational modeling. And computational modeling is why we have general circulation models of the Earth's climate. So like computational modeling is why we have the field of the science of ecology. And so it's hugely important to have very advanced science for computational modeling, scientific visualization, and information processing, which includes satellite remote sensing and other kinds of remote sensing, and the data analytics, data storage, data transfer, and data processing tools. So there's a huge realm for this, because if we want to create homeostasis for the planet, we need to create something that functions like the cerebellum does in our brain and what the corpus callosum does in our brain. The corpus callosum is the place where your left and right hemispheres connect within the neocortex, or within the whole cortex, actually. And it's the most dense range of connections because that's where all the global coherence of your brain comes about. It's because of this deep connectivity in that part of your brain. So if we're going to create a corpus callosum for the planet, then we're going to do a lot of high-tech information, like information communication technology design. And the blockchain and those other pieces that are, I would say, are subsets of that. So really high-tech information systems and really high-tech material science systems. And I would say really high-tech information creation systems. And I'd call it that way to be general, because, or I'd say maybe intelligence creation systems, because intelligence doesn't know what it's going to create yet, which is why it's sort of a catch-all word. We need ways of continuing to learn to get better at learning, and looking at what we've done with material science, like taking a transmission electron microscope, which is a piece of advanced technology, and looking at how the surface of the eye for a fruit fly works, and then creating a material for high altitude mountaineering is a pretty freaking awesome thing. And so I think that kind of high tech is going to be, it's going to remain important, especially during the transition when we have such scarce resources. During this next 50 years, it's going to be extremely important. And it may become more low tech after that, and that's okay. But I can't say for sure one way or the other. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to ask another question on behalf of Benjamin. Do you see any role for artists in this movement?
All of us are artists. Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about a couple of kinds of art. One kind of art that I think is really important, and if you really want to dig into this, go look at the writings of Peter Berg, as he was writing about bioregionalism at the Planet Drum Foundation, is that a lot of bioregional cultures are arts and crafts cultures. If you look on my wall right over here, this is mud-packed housing. This is earth and construction. An artist built that. If you look at that roof where someone has taken cañas, which is a relative of sugarcane, and they've treated it and processed it, that's a woodworker, that's craftsmanship, that's an artist. We have stone workers, we have pottery, we have basket weavers, because I'm in the Andes. There are all these kind of ancestral indigenous craft skills. A lot of bioregional economics is about craft skills, and you develop crafts with arts and crafts mindsets. So just in that way, you can see we're building an economy on arts and crafts. It's that foundational. Another way that arts and crafts, or that art plays a role in a really important way, is in meaning making, which has to do with songs and poetry, and how they can give us social context to express our feelings when we're not otherwise able to express them, to bring us together in ceremonial and ritualistic ways to form human bonds, to commiserate something being well done, which gets back to the craftsmanship of fermentation, like having beer and wine, both of which are fermented beverages, that actually having parties and festivals and doing theater and using them to tell our stories and to use them as like cultural seed banks. You know, think of William Shakespeare as a cultural seed bank of the 17th century and the 16th century. We have those plays to reenact the stories of those people at that time. It was the screenwriters who did that. And so you can see various ways that artists can play roles in all of this. And one of the more important ways that they can help, that's really important right now, is to help us dream bigger and to dream more realistically. Because right now we have entirely dystopian futures in all of our superhero movies. It's catastrophic what's happening with the film industry, just how much regurgitated shit is coming out of the film industry. Even though we have some of the best educated and best trained storytellers that history has, because so many people know how to do it well. And so we need to direct our storytelling toward emotional processing of grief, as maybe and I were talking about a few minutes ago, so that we can imagine different futures. You know, where I'm in Barichara, everyone's worried about water because we're running out of water here, but almost no one knows what to do about it. They don't know how to imagine it. They don't know that, you know, building ponds and planting trees will bring water back. They can't imagine it. They don't know how. So our storytellers can help them imagine better. And I think that's a really important thing to do right now. So those couple of pieces to arts, very important.
Great, thank you. And I want to get a question in too right now. So you're talking about overpopulation. So I'm wondering about the decision to become a parent. How do you view parenting? How do you view educating of children? Want to riff on that for a little bit for me?
Yeah, I just gave a webinar on parenting for Earth regeneration last weekend, and we have a 3.5-year-old daughter. And the way that I addressed this question in the webinar I gave was, I said the answer to the question, should you have children, or should anyone have children? The answer is an ethical question. And the ethical question is, are humans good for the planet or bad for the planet? And notice that's based in belief and not based in reality, because some humans are good for the planet and some humans are very obviously bad for the planet. So it's not simply one or the other. It's what do you believe and then what do you choose to enact? And so what I feel in a time of overpopulation is that anyone who chooses to have children needs to be responsible for raising their children to be net positive for the planet to the best that they can. And that's just an ethical requirement for them in this time. If they're aware of what's going on, they're either being selfish for doing it or they're being reckless because they're placing their child in danger. Because the next few decades are going to be pretty difficult. And so what I think of in terms of parenting and the regenerative practices related to parenting is some of it's really simple. Let kids play outdoors, give them unstructured time, teach them arts and crafts, teach them social and emotional skills. Like a lot of it's pretty basic, but then there's specific things that, like my wife and I made the decision that we wanted our daughter to feel like it's completely normal. Everyone around her regenerates landscapes. So we need to live in a place where that's happening and we need to help that happen. So our daughter is 3.5 and she's learning about water retention, reforestation, identifying native plants, and other things like this, because that's just what people do. And it's normative. We want it to be her social norm. And I think that regenerative parenting is around building these normative expectations. The other thing that we need to do as parents is cultivate really powerful complexity management skills. Like think of kids that do improv theater, or anyone who does improv theater or learns mindfulness meditation practices. They need to have a flexibility to adapt and update their thinking They need to have a high tolerance for uncertainty, and they need to work really well in teams. And so this is going to be really important for parenting. And then a third thing that I think is really important is parents themselves need to become students, which is we need to learn how to be regenerative with our children, oftentimes led by our children. We find ways for our children to get education that then we participate in and we learn too. Because one of the things that needs to happen is we need to undo a great mistake. The great mistake was this pattern of civilization has destroyed and killed most indigenous cultures on Earth. So every human being alive today is the descendant of indigenous people, but most of us don't remember it. Most of us had our ancestral lines cut off. And so our descendants, when we become ancestors, we need to begin the process of becoming indigenous for our descendants to be the future indigenous. And so as our children get these learning opportunities, we get to practice being indigenous. And so it means we participate in these practices as adults, as our children are doing it. And most of us don't know how to do it, so we learn right beside them. Which, by the way, I can attest. My daughter and my wife are in the other room making natural Play-Doh with our neighbor. How much fun it is to learn to be regenerative with your children. So this is actually a pretty awesome life. But those are a couple of the key pieces of it. Really important. Parenting is a big part of this.
Thank you. And then I want to get in this last question from Rhea. Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Raven. And thank you, Joe. I am just so resonant with how much emphasis you have on Indigenous cultures, because when you start to study the stories and the mythology, it's so obvious, like their connection to the earth and how they celebrated it and respected it. And I think as a global society, from the majority, we've really lost touch to that. And so my question is, like, how do we guide or inspire the human race back to that Indigenous inspired connection to the earth? And do you believe that we have the actual capacity as a global society to live harmoniously and synergistically with the planet?
We don't as a global society, but we do as planetary citizens of bioregional societies. All indigenous cultures are bioregional. And so I think that's the key, because we can still be planetary and have Gaia awareness, but we have to be regional, with our own landscapes. I have some friends that are doing really awesome work. It's Cassandra Ferreira, Zoe Wild, and Jennifer Menke, who are 3 women that each work with different wisdom traditions. And all of them are working with land regeneration and cooperative land ownership. And they have been developing something that they call the sacred contract, which is a bit confusing in a way, because the sacred contract is actually a relationship that you cultivate over time, more than specifically a contract. But the idea is how to help people begin to become indigenous by feeling a sacred connection to their land. So if you have someone who has a piece of land, there are simple things like find the oldest tree on your land, and then here's a simple ceremony. And from that ceremony, start to feel how precious that tree is. And so there are activities like this, and that's just a nice concrete example. Or if you live in a place where indigenous people still exist, they're First Nations people, invite them onto the land and do a reclamation process. Ask for their blessing for regenerating the land, ask for their wisdom and their guidance, and show your humility as someone from the colonizer culture, which will give you access to trust-based relationships to build a sacred relationship to the land. And so Cassandra, Zoe, and Jennifer have been developing this as a way of helping people make land purchasing decisions. So if someone wants to buy land, they might put a deed restriction, they might put it into a community land trust, they might create an eco-village or an intentional community. But if they don't go through this process of making the land sacred, then they don't know how to legally protect the land, and they're not cultivating the cultural capacity to protect the land. And so, so I think this is how we do it, is by forming intimate relationships, body-based relationships with the land that we're on. And when we do that, it's amazing how apt, how capable humans are of feeling the sacred. And so even those of us who have been like PTSD for decades, will be surprised by the healing power of touching the oldest tree on their land and weeping that the tree is not old enough. Maybe the oldest tree is 20 years old. And just think like how painful that is. And so like, so that opening up is, I think, is how we do it through these very simple practices. And we do it as locally as possible so that you can walk back to that place anytime and reestablish the connection.
Great, that was beautiful. Thank you. So, Joe, where are ways we can reach you, or what are things, how can we get involved in projects that you're doing and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, I'm actually very intentionally trying to remove psychological shadow patterns from my life because I have a long history of being like a flame that attracts narcissistic moths. And so I'm not trying to promote my work. What I'm trying to do is promote Gaia's work as much as I can. And there is a project I'm involved with that has come into being through this mindset, which is we have a study group called Earth Regenerators, which is hosted on a mobile app called Mighty Networks. And so it's a really powerful app for hosting online courses, but I'm giving a free version that's in the spirit of the gift economy. Earth Regenerators now has like 1,300 members and it's only 4.5 months old. It's just becoming something pretty cool. And its structure is around what I want people to be a part of, which is how do we learn how to see the design pathway for regenerating the entire planet by regenerating the landscapes that make our own lives possible. Where does our water come from? Where does our food come from? Where do all of our building materials come from, etc.? How do we connect to our land? And then how can we change those relationships in a coordinated and nested fashion so that it scales up to planetary health? And so the Earth Regenerators study group is a place of learning for us to all figure that out together. And everyone is invited. But what I care about even more than that is go find that old tree on your land. You know, like do the regenerative work in yourself. And don't worry about doing it with me unless you're really drawn to something that is you're specifically needing that happens to be in the space that I'm holding. Because too many egos are getting in the way of this work right now. We all just need to get to it. But I just feel really honored and blessed to be a conduit for this conversation in this time when we all need to be doing this work.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you so much for being here. It was really a pleasure.
No, thank you for having me. It's awesome to be here.
Yay. And with that, I'll pass it over to Peter and we'll do closing statements.
Yeah, I'll make some announcements in a moment, but I just want to throw some appreciation at Joe's way. Jason Snyder, who's also here, we were talking last night about, you know, the people who are talking about this meta crisis, and some of the energy that surrounds it is like an energy of shame. You know, you're not being good enough in order, or you're not addressing this the right way. And listening to you talk, like, it's evident you know your stuff, and it's evident that you're not shy about talking real. But I feel it's coming from a place of like deep care and love, and it's just fucking beautiful. So thank you for coming today, man, and visiting the Stoa. We'd love to have you back. And you know, we talked about a lot of intense stuff here, so we're gonna have a sense-making session afterwards. It's gonna be run by Raven. I have to go, but she will take care of that. And I'll just do some announcements for upcoming sessions at the Stoa. We have a Pat Ryan tonight at the Dark Stoa. That's at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. Yancey Strickler, the co-founder of Kickstarter, he's coming in on Monday, June 1st, 4 p.m. Eastern time on Bentoism, Guide to Self-Coherence. And then Daniel Thornson's Welcome Back Party at the same day on Monday, June 1st, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. He's going to talk about his experience of being away for 75 days, I believe, in silent meditation. So that's going to be quite a treat. That being said, Raven, do you want to plug your Socratic speed dating event?
Sure. So yeah, later on today, I'll be hosting a kind of social mixer event. We'll be playing a game called Asshole, which is a social boundary breaking game. So I would invite all of you to come if you want to get your social boundaries broken a little bit and meet some people here at the Stoa. So
yeah, and those are really fun. That's 7 p.m. Eastern time today. And the Stoa is based off the gift economy, as we view it as a gift for us to use freely in this time of need. If you're inspired to provide a gift to the Stoa, you can just go to the webpage and check out the gift economy at the bottom of the page. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.